Why do you have my eyes? The boy's voice was soft, almost curious, but it cut through the polished silence of the executive floor like something that didn't belong there, something too honest for a place built on control and calculated words. And Daniel Hayes felt it before he understood it, a subtle tightening in his chest as he looked down from the glass-walled conference room where million-dollar decisions were made in under 10 minutes. And for a moment he didn't move, didn't breathe. Because the child standing just a few feet away wasn't supposed to be there, not in this world of tailored suits and quiet authority, not with those wide, steady blue eyes that held his gaze without fear or hesitation, eyes that looked familiar, impossibly familiar, and the room, once filled with the low hum of executives and the faint tapping of tablets, fell into an uneasy stillness as if everyone sensed something shift. Something invisible but undeniable, and Daniel slowly set his pen down. The sleek black surface of the table reflecting the sharp lines of his expression, controlled, composed, but cracking just enough at the edges to betray confusion, because he didn't recognize the boy, he was certain of that, and yet there was something in the way the child stood, in the quiet confidence that didn't match his small frame, that unsettled him in a way no negotiation ever had. And then he saw her. Just beyond the doorway, standing still as if she had been holding her breath for years, Emily Carter, her coat worn at the edges, her hand gripping the strap of a faded bag, her posture straight despite the exhaustion written in the shadows beneath her eyes, and for a brief second their gazes met, hers steady, his searching, and it wasn't anger he saw there, not even accusation, but something heavier, something quieter, like a truth that had waited too long to be spoken. And Daniel's jaw tightened as the pieces refused to align, because this didn't make sense, none of it did. He had built his life on precision, on knowing exactly who and what mattered, and yet here was a woman he barely remembered and a child who looked at him like he already knew the answer to a question Daniel hadn't even begun to ask, and the boy took a small step closer, unafraid of the tension in the room, his voice softer this time, almost thoughtful. "Mom said you forgot?" And the words landed differently, not sharp, not loud, but heavy, like they carried something older than this moment, something that stretched back beyond boardrooms and quarterly reports, and Daniel felt something flicker behind his carefully constructed calm, a memory just out of reach, like a reflection you can't quite focus on, and he straightened slightly, his voice measured, controlled. "I don't forget people." But even as he said it, it sounded less certain than it should have, and Emily stepped forward then, her movements slow, deliberate, as if each step had been rehearsed in her mind 100 times before this moment, and the soft echo of her shoes against the polished floor seemed louder than it should have been, drawing every eye in the room toward her. But she didn't look at anyone else, only at him, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady in a way that didn't match the storm quietly building beneath the surface. "You forgot," she repeated, not louder, not harsher, just certain, and Daniel felt it again, that subtle shift, that crack in the certainty he had always relied on, and for the first time in years, he didn't have an immediate answer, didn't have a clean, logical explanation to shut the moment down, and instead he found himself watching her, really watching her. Noticing the way her fingers trembled just slightly before going still again, the way she held herself like someone who had learned how to survive being overlooked, and somewhere deep beneath the surface of his controlled exterior, something began to move, something he couldn't name yet, but couldn't ignore either, and the boy, still standing between them, glanced from one to the other, unaware of the weight of what he had just set in motion. And in that fragile, suspended moment, Daniel Hayes, who could buy anything, control everything, command anyone, realized he was standing in front of something he couldn't immediately understand, and for the first time in a very long time, that unsettled him. Daniel did not answer right away, and that silence stretched longer than it should have in a room where he was never the one without control, his eyes still fixed on the boy as if studying him would somehow rearrange reality into something more logical. But nothing about this felt logical, not the way the child stood there with quiet certainty, not the way Emily remained just behind him without rushing forward or explaining herself. And certainly not the way a faint, unwelcome familiarity kept pressing at the edges of Daniel's thoughts like a memory that refused to fully surface, and the executives around the table began to shift uncomfortably, exchanging glances, unsure whether to speak or stay silent, because they had never seen their CEO hesitate before, never seen him pause like this over something that did not belong to numbers or strategy. And finally Daniel exhaled slowly, straightening his posture as if reclaiming himself piece by piece. "Who let you in here?" he asked, his tone calm but sharper now, directed not at the boy but toward the room, toward the breach of order. Because if this was a mistake, he would correct it, he always did. But Emily answered before anyone else could move, her voice steady. "No one let us in." And there was no apology in it, no hesitation, just a simple truth that seemed to carry more weight than it should have. And Daniel's gaze snapped back to her, narrowing slightly as he studied her face more carefully this time, searching for recognition, for context, for anything that would explain why she spoke to him like she already knew him, like she had already accepted something he had not. And he took a step closer, closing the distance just enough to lower his voice without losing authority. "If you have something to say, you will say it clearly." And for a brief moment, Emily's composure flickered, not breaking, but shifting, like someone holding back years of words behind a single breath. And she reached into her bag with slow, deliberate movement, the faint rustle of paper sounding louder than it should have in the quiet room. And Daniel watched her hand carefully, not with fear, but with a controlled tension, because whatever she was about to show him, it was already changing the way this moment felt. And when she pulled out the envelope, it looked ordinary, plain, the kind of thing that could be overlooked on any desk in the building, and yet the way she held it made it feel anything but insignificant, and she stepped forward, placing it gently on the polished table between them without breaking eye contact. "Then explain this," she said, her voice softer now, but somehow stronger, as if she had reached the point where nothing could shake her anymore. And Daniel glanced down at the envelope, then back at her, irritation rising just enough to sharpen his expression, because he did not like ambiguity, he did not like games, and this felt dangerously close to both. "I do not have time for this," he said, though his hand did not move away, did not dismiss the object in front of him the way his words suggested he would, and the boy, still standing quietly, tilted his head slightly, watching Daniel with an expression that was almost thoughtful, as if he were waiting for something, not demanding, not anxious, just certain, and that certainty unsettled Daniel more than anything else, more than Emily's calm, more than the unexpected intrusion, because it implied a truth that existed whether he acknowledged it or not. And finally, with a controlled motion, he reached for the envelope, his fingers brushing against the edge as if testing its reality, and the moment he picked it up, the room seemed to hold its breath again. And he opened it carefully, not rushing, not hesitating, just deliberate, always deliberate, and as the first photograph slid into view, something in his expression shifted, subtle but undeniable, the kind of change that only someone watching closely would notice, and his eyes lingered on the image longer than necessary, scanning details, searching for inconsistencies, for proof that this was a misunderstanding, a coincidence, anything but what it seemed to suggest. And yet the longer he looked, the quieter the room became, until even the unspoken assumptions hanging in the air felt too loud to ignore, and Daniel slowly lifted his gaze back to Emily, the calm certainty in his eyes no longer as solid as it had been moments before. "Where did you get this?" he asked, and for the first time, it was not a question meant to control the situation, it was a question that needed an answer, and Emily did not look away as she replied, "You were there." And the words landed with a weight that no denial could immediately erase, because deep down, somewhere beneath the layers of memory he had chosen not to revisit, Daniel felt it, not the full truth yet, not the complete picture, but the undeniable beginning of it, and it was enough to make him realize that this was not a mistake he could dismiss, not a moment he could control, because whatever he had forgotten, it had not forgotten him. Daniel did not realize he had stopped breathing until the silence pressed too tightly against his chest and forced him to draw in a slow, controlled breath. But even that felt different now, heavier somehow, as his eyes dropped back to the photograph in his hand, tracing the edges as if the paper itself might explain what his mind refused to accept. And there it was again, that flicker of something buried, not a full memory, not even close, but a sensation, a place, a moment that did not fit. into the precise timeline he had built his life upon, and he shifted his weight slightly, grounding himself in the familiar firmness of the polished floor beneath his shoes, in the quiet hum of the building systems, in anything that felt stable, because the image in his hand was not, and Emily watched him without interruption, without urgency, her stillness almost unsettling in its patience. As if she had already lived through this moment countless times in her mind and knew exactly how it would unfold, and the boy stepped a little closer to her now, his small hand brushing against her sleeve, not out of fear, but out of quiet instinct, and Daniel noticed that too, the way the child gravitated toward her without hesitation, the way his presence seemed anchored by her calm rather than shaken by the tension in the room, and it stirred something else in Daniel, something unfamiliar. Something that did not belong in boardrooms or contracts, and he cleared his throat slightly, forcing his voice back into the controlled tone that had always served him well. "You expect me to believe that I was part of this?" he asked, lifting the photograph just enough for her to see, though his eyes never left hers, and Emily did not react with frustration or defensiveness, only a quiet certainty that felt far more difficult to challenge. "I do not expect anything from you," she replied, her voice even. "I just brought what you left behind." And the words settled into the space between them with a weight that could not be ignored, and Daniel felt it again, that subtle fracture in his certainty. Because he was not a man who left things behind, he was a man who controlled outcomes, who closed every chapter with precision, and yet the evidence in his hand suggested something incomplete, something unresolved, and his jaw tightened slightly as he looked back down at the photograph, forcing himself to analyze it with the same detached logic he applied to everything else: the date printed in the corner, the background setting, the faint reflection in the glass behind the figures, details that should have anchored the moment in clarity but instead only deepened the unease, because the more he looked, the harder it became to dismiss, and he lowered the photograph slowly, his voice quieter now, though no less firm. "This could be manipulated," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, they lacked the conviction he intended, and Emily's expression softened just slightly. Not in triumph, but in something closer to understanding, as if she recognized the instinct to deny before accepting something that changed everything, and she reached into the envelope again, pulling out another piece of paper, this one more official, more structured, and she placed it beside the photograph without a word, allowing the document to speak for itself, and Daniel's gaze shifted to it reluctantly, drawn by the same need for clarity that had always guided him, and as his eyes moved across the printed lines, the names, the dates, the unmistakable details that connected everything together, something inside him stilled, not calm, not resolved, but suspended, as if the world around him had momentarily lost its usual order, and he felt the weight of the room again, the quiet attention of every person present, though none of them dared to speak, and the boy's voice broke through the silence once more, softer now, almost thoughtful. "Mom said you would not remember." And Daniel looked up at him instinctively, meeting those steady blue eyes again, and this time he could not look away as quickly, because there it was, clearer now, not just a resemblance, but a connection that logic alone could not fully dismiss, and for the first time in years, Daniel Hayes did not feel in control of the narrative unfolding in front of him. And that realization, more than anything else, unsettled him deeply, because control had always been his foundation, and without it, he was left facing something far more unpredictable, something that could not be negotiated or dismissed, only understood, and he realized, with a quiet, undeniable certainty, that this moment was not going to end the way he expected it to, because whatever truth Emily had brought into this room, it was already changing everything. Daniel lowered the document slowly but did not let go of it, his fingers tightening just slightly along the edge as if the act of holding it could somehow keep the situation contained, controlled, manageable, but nothing about this felt manageable anymore, and the familiar rhythm of his thoughts, the precise structure he relied on to navigate every decision, had begun to fracture in quiet, unsettling ways. And he shifted his gaze back to Emily, studying her with a sharper intensity now, not as an inconvenience to be dismissed but as a variable that refused to fit into any predictable pattern, and for the first time since she had walked into his world, he noticed what he had missed before, not just the exhaustion in her posture, but the restraint, the way she held herself back from saying more than necessary, as if she understood that the truth did not need force, only time. And that realization unsettled him more than accusation ever could have, because it meant she was not here to argue, not here to demand, but here to present something undeniable and let it stand on its own. And Daniel drew in a slow breath, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "How old is he?" he asked, and the question seemed simple, almost procedural, but the weight behind it shifted something in the room, because it was no longer denial, no longer dismissal, it was the beginning of acknowledgement, however reluctant, and Emily answered without hesitation. 6. And the number landed with a quiet finality that made Daniel's jaw tighten, because 6 years was not a small oversight, not a minor gap in memory. It was a span of time that should have been filled with something he could not immediately recall, and his mind moved quickly, calculating, aligning dates, reconstructing fragments of the past with the same precision he applied to business strategies. But this was different, because the more he searched, the more he encountered something unfamiliar, not absence, but avoidance. As if there were moments he had deliberately chosen not to revisit, not to question. And that thought unsettled him deeply, because it implied not a failure of memory, but a decision, and Daniel Hayes did not forget, he chose, always, and the boy shifted his weight slightly, his small sneakers making the faintest sound against the floor as he looked up at Daniel again, his expression still calm, still curious, as if this moment did not intimidate him the way it should have. And Daniel found himself looking back at him longer this time, searching not just for resemblance but for something more, something intangible that could either confirm or deny what the evidence suggested. And it was there, in the shape of his gaze, in the quiet confidence that did not belong to a child raised in uncertainty, and Daniel felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest again, not fear, not anger, but something quieter, heavier, something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time, and he looked away first, his attention returning to the document as if it could restore order to his thoughts. But the lines on the page no longer felt like neutral information, they felt personal, unavoidable, and he exhaled slowly, setting the paper down with controlled precision, though the movement carried more weight than intended, and the room remained silent, the kind of silence that did not need to be enforced because no one dared to break it, and Daniel straightened slightly, reclaiming just enough of his composure to speak again. "If what you are suggesting is true," he began, his tone measured, careful, "then there are questions that need to be answered." And Emily nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition, as if she had been waiting for that exact moment, that shift from resistance to inquiry, and she stepped closer, not aggressively, but with quiet purpose. "I am not here to answer your questions," she said softly. "I am here so you can finally ask them." And something about the way she said it, the calm certainty, the absence of demand, unsettled Daniel more than any accusation could have, because it placed the responsibility entirely on him, not on her to prove, not on the situation to justify itself, but on him to confront what he had chosen not to see, and, for a brief moment, the controlled world he had built around himself felt thinner than it ever had before, like a surface that could no longer fully conceal what lay beneath, and he realized, with a clarity that was both quiet and undeniable, that this was no longer about whether he remembered, it was about whether he was willing to face the possibility that he had not wanted to. Daniel did not respond immediately, and that hesitation lingered longer than anything else in the room, longer than the silence, longer than the weight of the documents resting on the table, because for the first time in years, he did not have a clear next move, and that unsettled him in a way he could not easily dismiss, and he turned slightly, his gaze shifting away from Emily and the boy toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city skyline beyond, the familiar view that had always grounded him, always reminded him of the life he had built with precision and intent. But even that view felt different now, distant somehow, like something he was observing rather than controlling, and he pressed his lips together briefly before speaking again, his voice quieter, more contained. "We are not continuing this here." And the words were not a command so much as a boundary, a way to reclaim structure in a moment that had slipped beyond it, and he reached for the documents again, gathering them with deliberate care before turning back toward Emily, his expression composed but no longer entirely unshaken. "Come with me," he added, not harshly, not urgently, but with a controlled insistence that left little room for refusal, and Emily hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding, her hand finding the boy's shoulder gently as she guided him forward, and the movement was simple, natural, but it did something to Daniel that he could not immediately explain, the quiet familiarity of it, the ease of it, as if this was something she had done countless times without him, and that realization settled somewhere deeper than he expected, and without another word, he turned and walked toward the private hallway leading to his office, aware of the eyes following them, the unspoken questions lingering behind, but he did not acknowledge any of it, because this was no longer a situation for observation, it was something that demanded clarity, and the door to his office closed with a soft, definitive sound that separated them from the rest of the world, leaving only the three of them in the quiet, controlled space that Daniel had always considered his domain, and for a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretching again, but this time it felt different, more contained, more focused, and Daniel set the documents down on his desk, the polished surface reflecting their edges in sharp detail, and he moved behind the desk instinctively, positioning himself where he was most comfortable, where he had always maintained control. But as he looked up again, meeting Emily's steady gaze and the boy's quiet curiosity, that sense of control felt thinner than it ever had before. And he exhaled slowly, his hands resting lightly against the edge of the desk, grounding himself before he spoke. "Start from the beginning," he said, his tone firm but not dismissive, not this time, and Emily did not rush to fill the silence, did not take advantage of the invitation to overwhelm him with explanation. Instead, she stepped forward slightly, her posture still calm, still composed, and for a brief moment, her eyes moved to the boy before returning to Daniel, as if measuring what to say, how to say it, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet steadiness that felt almost deliberate. "You already know the beginning," she said, and Daniel's brow tightened slightly, a flicker of frustration crossing his expression before settling back into controlled focus. "Then remind me," he replied, and something in his tone shifted there, not quite defensive, not quite open, but somewhere in between, as if he was standing at the edge of something he could not fully see yet, and Emily held his gaze for a moment longer before reaching into the envelope once more, pulling out a smaller photograph this time, one that looked older, more worn at the edges, and she placed it gently on the desk between them. And Daniel looked down at it reluctantly, his eyes scanning the image, taking in the details, the setting, the expressions, and then something changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough for him to feel it, a faint shift in recognition, a moment that felt closer now, less distant, and he leaned slightly forward without realizing it, his focus narrowing as the edges of the memory began to take shape, not fully formed, not clear, but present in a way they had not been before. And his voice, when he spoke again, was quieter, almost uncertain in a way no one had ever heard from him. "That place," he said slowly, as if testing the words. "I have been there." And Emily nodded once, her expression unchanged but her eyes softening just enough to acknowledge what he had just admitted, and the boy watched both of them closely, silent now, but no longer just observing, because something was unfolding, something that connected them in ways Daniel was only beginning to understand, and as he looked down at the photograph again, the city skyline forgotten behind him, Daniel Hayes realized that the answers he was about to uncover were not going to fit neatly into the life he had built, because they belonged to a part of him he had never truly accounted for, a part that had not disappeared, only waited to be seen. Daniel did not take his eyes off the photograph as the memory continued to press forward, not all at once, not clearly, but in fragments that felt too real to ignore, the kind that did not ask permission before resurfacing, and he leaned back slightly, one hand resting against the edge of his desk while the other still held the image, his fingers tightening just enough to crease the corner without realizing it, and for a moment, the polished office around him seemed to fade, the quiet hum of the building dissolving into something else, something older, something less controlled, and he exhaled slowly, his voice lower now, less certain. It was a small town, he said, almost to himself, and Emily did not interrupt, did not rush to confirm or correct him. She simply watched, allowing the memory to find its own shape, and that restraint, that patience, made the moment feel heavier, more real, because it was not being forced, it was unfolding, and Daniel's brow tightened slightly as more details began to surface, the faint outline of a street, the soft glow of lights reflecting off rain-soaked pavement, the sound of distant traffic muted by distance, and something else, something more personal, a conversation, unfinished, unresolved, and he closed his eyes briefly, not in avoidance, but in focus, as if narrowing his attention could pull the rest of it into clarity, and when he opened them again, they were sharper, but no less unsettled. You were there, he said, looking directly at Emily now, and it was no longer a question, but not yet a full acknowledgement either, and she nodded once, her expression unchanged, her voice steady. Yes. And the simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any explanation could have, and Daniel swallowed quietly, the movement subtle but noticeable, because he was not a man who struggled for words, not in any room, not in any situation, and yet here, in his own office, he felt something unfamiliar pressing against the edges of his composure, something that did not respond to logic or structure, and the boy shifted slightly beside Emily, his gaze moving between them with quiet curiosity, not fully understanding the gravity of what was unfolding, but sensing it nonetheless, and Daniel noticed that too, the way the child remained calm, unafraid, as if he belonged here more than Daniel was ready to accept, and that realization stirred something deeper, something that did not belong to business or strategy, and he forced his attention back to the present, back to the photograph, to the evidence in front of him, because that was something he could analyze, something he could understand, and he placed the image down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the desk as if restoring order through precision, and his voice, when he spoke again, was steadier, but carried a new weight beneath it. You are telling me that 6 years ago, I met you, and somehow everything that followed disappeared. And Emily's gaze softened slightly, not in sympathy, but in recognition of the shift in his tone, the movement from denial to confrontation, and she shook her head gently. No, she said, her voice quiet but firm. It did not disappear. And Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of tension returning as he tried to reconcile her words with what he was beginning to remember, and she continued, her gaze steady on his. You walked away. And the words did not land like an accusation, they landed like a fact, simple, unembellished, and impossible to deflect, and Daniel felt it then, not just the memory, but the implication of it, the possibility that what he had been framing as absence was something else entirely, something chosen, something deliberate, and his jaw tightened as he looked away briefly, his gaze drifting toward the window before returning to her, because this was no longer something he could ignore, not with the evidence in front of him, not with the quiet certainty in her voice, and the boy spoke again, his voice softer this time, almost thoughtful. Mom said you were busy. And the words, simple as they were, struck something deeper than anything else had, because they reframed the entire situation in a way Daniel had not considered, not as a mistake, not as a lost memory, but as a choice, a prioritization, and, for a moment, the carefully constructed narrative of his life, the one built on control and intention, felt incomplete, as if a piece had been deliberately left out, and he inhaled slowly, the breath measured but heavier than before, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, less guarded. What happened after that night? He asked, and it was the first time the question carried genuine uncertainty, not as a strategy, not as a means of control, but as a need to understand, and Emily held his gaze for a moment longer before answering, her voice calm, steady, and unshaken. Life happened. And the simplicity of her response carried a weight that extended far beyond the words themselves, because it spoke of years he had not seen, of moments he had not been part of a reality that had unfolded without him, and Daniel Hayes, who had always believed he accounted for everything, realized in that quiet moment that there were entire chapters of a story he had never read, not because they were hidden, but because he had never turned the page. Daniel remained still after her words settled into the quiet space, not because he did not understand them, but because he understood them too well, and that made them harder to face, because life happened was not an explanation he could analyze or reduce into steps. It was something vast, something that implied years of moments he had not been present for, choices he had not made, consequences he had not witnessed. And for a man who had built everything on precision, on control, on knowing exactly how and why things unfolded, that absence felt unfamiliar and deeply unsettling, and he lowered his gaze briefly to the desk, his fingers resting against the edge of the photograph as if anchoring himself to something tangible, something he could still define. But even that felt insufficient now, because the reality in front of him was no longer confined to documents or images. It was standing just a few feet away, breathing, watching, waiting, and he exhaled slowly, the breath measured, but heavier than before, as he looked up again, his eyes moving first to the boy, really looking this time, not just at the resemblance but at the details, the way he stood with quiet steadiness, the way his expression held curiosity without fear, the way his presence seemed so natural beside Emily. And something shifted again inside Daniel, something quieter but more persistent, like a realization forming beneath the surface, and he spoke, his voice lower now, stripped of the sharper edges it had carried before. "What is his name?" And the question lingered in the air, simple but significant, because it was no longer about denial or evidence, it was about recognition, however tentative, and Emily answered without hesitation, her voice soft but unwavering. "Ethan." And Daniel repeated it silently, the name settling into his thoughts with a weight he could not ignore. "Ethan," and he nodded almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging something without fully understanding it yet, and the boy glanced up at him, his expression shifting just slightly, not into a smile, but into something more open, as if the question itself had mattered, and Daniel felt that too, the subtle change, the way a single word could alter the atmosphere between them, and he looked away briefly, his gaze drifting toward the window again, but this time he did not see the city, did not see the structure and order that usually defined his world. Instead he saw fragments, incomplete images that were beginning to connect in ways he had not anticipated. And he turned back toward Emily, his posture still controlled, but his expression no longer entirely guarded. "You said I walked away?" he said, and there was no accusation in it now, only a need to understand, and Emily held his gaze for a moment before responding, her voice steady, grounded in something that did not waver. "You had a call," she said. "Something important, something you could not ignore." And Daniel's brow tightened slightly as the memory pressed forward again, clearer now, more defined, the faint echo of a phone vibrating, the shift in his attention, the decision made in a moment that seemed insignificant at the time, and yet now carried a weight he had never accounted for, and he nodded slowly, the movement subtle but deliberate, because he could see it now, not the full picture, but enough to understand how easily something important could have been left unfinished, how quickly a moment could be set aside in favor of something that seemed more urgent, and he swallowed quietly, the realization settling deeper than he expected, and Ethan spoke again, his voice soft but clear. "Mom said you had a big job." And Daniel looked at him, meeting his gaze fully this time, and there was no judgment in the boy's expression, no resentment, only a simple acceptance of what he had been told, and that, more than anything else, made something shift inside Daniel, because it meant the story he had been absent from had been told without anger, without blame, and he found himself asking, almost before he realized it, "And what did you think?" And Ethan shrugged slightly, a small, honest gesture. "I thought you were busy," he said, and Daniel let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, something in between, because the simplicity of it cut deeper than any accusation could have, and he looked down again at the photograph, at the document, at the pieces of a story he had never fully seen, and for the first time, he did not try to reorganize them into something easier to accept, he simply let them be what they were, incomplete, complicated, real, and when he looked up again, his voice was quieter, steadier in a different way, not controlled, but honest. "I do not remember everything," he admitted, and the words felt unfamiliar, but not untrue, and Emily nodded slightly, not surprised, not disappointed, just acknowledging what he had finally said out loud, and in that moment, Daniel Hayes realized that this was not about proving what had happened, it was about understanding what he had missed, and that understanding was only just beginning. Daniel let the silence sit after his admission, not because he had nothing more to say, but because for the first time, he understood that speaking too quickly would only push him further away from something he needed to face slowly, carefully, and he rested his hands against the edge of the desk again, grounding himself in the familiar weight of it, though even that felt less certain now. As if the stability he had always relied on was being quietly questioned by everything unfolding in front of him, and his gaze shifted once more to Ethan, lingering there longer than before, studying the boy not as a possibility, not as a problem to solve, but as a presence he could no longer ignore, and the details became sharper the longer he looked, the way Ethan's eyes held his without hesitation. The slight tilt of his head when he was thinking, the calmness that did not match the situation, and something in that calmness felt familiar in a way Daniel could not dismiss, not anymore, and he inhaled slowly before speaking again, his voice quieter now, stripped of the certainty that had once defined every word he spoke. 6 years? He said, almost under his breath, as if testing the reality of it, and Emily nodded slightly, her posture unchanged, her patience steady, as if she had already accepted the weight of that number long before he ever had to, and Daniel looked back at her, his expression more open now, though still guarded in ways he did not yet know how to let go of. You said life happened? He continued, his tone more thoughtful than defensive. Then tell me what that looked like. And this time, the request was not about control, it was about understanding, about filling in the space that had been left empty for too long, and Emily did not answer immediately, her gaze shifting briefly to Ethan as if considering how much to say, how much to reveal in a moment that already carried so much weight, and then she spoke, her voice calm but carrying something deeper beneath it, something lived. It looked like working 2 jobs and still checking every receipt twice, she said. It looked like choosing between what was needed and what could wait. And Daniel felt something tighten in his chest at the simplicity of her words, because they did not sound dramatic, they did not sound like a story meant to provoke sympathy, they sounded like reality. Unfiltered and steady, and she continued, her gaze steady on his. It looked like him learning to walk while I was holding on to whatever I could just to keep up. And Ethan glanced up at her briefly, not surprised by her words, just listening, as if he had heard parts of this before, and Daniel shifted slightly where he stood, the image forming in his mind not as something abstract, but as something tangible, something he had not been there to see, not because it had been hidden from him, but because he had never asked, and that realization settled deeper than he expected, and he exhaled slowly, his voice quieter when he spoke again. And you never tried to find me? And the question lingered, not accusatory, but searching, and Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her answer simple, unembellished. I did, she said, and that single statement shifted something again, because it removed the last comfortable assumption he might have held, and Daniel's brow tightened slightly, a flicker of something sharper returning as he tried to process that. Then why now? He asked, and this time there was no edge in his tone, only a need to understand the timing, the choice, the moment, and Emily held his gaze for a moment longer before answering, her voice steady, grounded in something that did not waver. Because he asked? She said, and Ethan looked at her again, then back at Daniel, not confused, not uncertain, just present in the moment, and Daniel felt that answer settled differently than the others, because it was not driven by circumstance or necessity, it was driven by something simpler, something more human, and he looked back at Ethan, seeing him not just as a reflection of possibility, but as a person, a child who had grown without him, who had asked the question that led them here, and for a moment, the room felt smaller, quieter, as if everything else had faded away, and Daniel realized that this was no longer about proving the past, it was about facing the present, about deciding what to do with something he could no longer ignore, and he straightened slightly, not to regain control, but to steady himself in a different way, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet weight that had not been there before. And what did he ask? And Emily's expression softened just slightly as she answered. He asked why you were not there. And the words did not strike like an accusation. They settled, quiet and unavoidable, and Daniel Hayes, who had built a life around being present where it mattered most, realized in that moment that there was one place he had never shown up, and that absence was no longer something he could explain away, only something he had to face. Daniel did not look away after her words settled between them, because this time there was nowhere for his attention to go that felt more important, more immediate, and the question Ethan had asked seemed to linger in the room long after it was spoken, simple and direct in a way that cut through every layer of complexity Daniel had built around his life, and he exhaled slowly, the breath measured but heavier than before, as if he was adjusting to the weight of something he had never fully carried until now, and his gaze shifted again to Ethan, holding it longer, not searching for resemblance anymore, not questioning the possibility, but acknowledging something quieter, something that did not need proof in the way he had once required it to, and he spoke carefully, his voice lower, more deliberate. And what did you tell him? And Emily's expression softened slightly, not with relief, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of calm acceptance, as if this moment had been inevitable for a long time, and she answered without hesitation. I told him the truth I could live with, she said, and Daniel's brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition that there was more beneath those words than they revealed, and she continued, her gaze steady on his. I told him that some people are not meant to stay, even if they were meant to matter. And the sentence settled heavily, not as an accusation, but as a quiet boundary she had built over time, something that had allowed her to move forward without waiting for something that never came, and Daniel felt that too, the implication of it, the space he had left behind not just in her life, but in the story she had been forced to tell in his absence, and he looked down briefly, his fingers brushing against the edge of the desk as if grounding himself again, because this was not a negotiation he could steer, not a situation he could resolve with a clear solution. It was something that required him to sit with discomfort, to understand what it meant to be absent in ways that could not be undone. And Ethan shifted slightly where he stood, his small hand resting lightly against the side of the desk now, his eyes still on Daniel, not with expectation, not with judgment, but with a quiet curiosity that felt far more difficult to face. And Daniel noticed that too, the absence of blame, the absence of anger. And something about that unsettled him more than anything else had, because it left no room for defense, no space to push back, only a clear reflection of what had been missing, and he straightened slightly, not to regain control, but to steady himself in a different way, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a new kind of weight, one that was not rooted in authority, but in something closer to responsibility. And now, he said, his gaze moving between them, what do you want from me? And the question hung in the air, not as a challenge, but as an offering, as if he was finally acknowledging that this moment was not just about understanding the past, but about deciding what came next. And Emily did not answer immediately, her eyes lingering on him for a moment longer before shifting briefly to Ethan, and there was something in that glance, something unspoken but clear, as if the answer did not belong to her alone, and when she looked back at Daniel, her voice was calm, steady, unchanged. I did not come here to ask for anything, she said, and Daniel held her gaze, searching for any sign of hesitation, any indication that there was more beneath the surface. But there was none, only the same quiet certainty she had carried from the moment she walked in, and she continued, her tone gentle but firm. I came because he deserved to see you. And Ethan looked up at her again, then back at Daniel, his expression still open, still unguarded, and Daniel felt something shift deeper this time, something that did not come from logic or memory, but from the simple weight of being seen, not as a CEO, not as a man defined by success, but as someone who had been missing from a part of the world that mattered more than he had ever accounted for. And he inhaled slowly, the breath steady but deliberate, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more grounded than before. And what if I am not the person he expects? And the question lingered not as doubt, but as a rare moment of honesty, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering it in a way that felt thoughtful beyond his years, and then he answered, his voice soft but certain. Then you can just be who you are. No. And the simplicity of it settled into the room with a quiet clarity that no argument could disrupt, and Daniel Hayes, who had spent his entire life becoming exactly who he needed to be for every situation, realized in that moment that this might be the first time he was being asked to be something else entirely, not more, not better, just present. Daniel did not respond right away, not because he did not hear the boy's words, but because he felt them settle somewhere deeper than anything else had that day, somewhere beyond logic, beyond strategy, in a place he had not needed to access in years, and he remained still for a moment, his gaze fixed on Ethan, as if trying to understand how something so simple could carry so much weight, and the room felt quieter now, not tense, not heavy in the same way as before, but still, like a moment, waiting to be defined by what came next. And Daniel slowly stepped away from the desk, the movement subtle but significant, because it was the first time he had moved out from behind it since they entered, the first time he had stepped away from the position that had always separated him from everyone else, and he stopped a few feet in front of Ethan, not too close, not imposing, just present, and for a brief second, he hesitated, as if measuring something he had never needed to measure before. And then he spoke, his voice quieter, stripped of the authority it once carried. "What do you like to do?" And the question was simple, almost unexpected, but it shifted the space between them in a way no statement had, and Ethan blinked once, surprised but not uncertain, and he shrugged slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I like building things," he said. "With blocks, with anything." And Daniel nodded slowly, the answer settling into his thoughts in a way he did not fully understand yet, but did not dismiss either, and he glanced briefly at Emily, as if confirming something without words, and she met his gaze with the same calm steadiness, not guiding him, not correcting him, just allowing the moment to unfold as it needed to. And Daniel looked back at Ethan, his posture less rigid now, less guarded. "Do you build them by yourself?" he asked, and Ethan shook his head, a small, honest movement. "Sometimes," he said, "but it is better when someone helps." And Daniel felt that again, that quiet shift, the way a simple statement could carry something more, something unspoken but clear, and he exhaled slowly, not as a release, but as an adjustment, as if recalibrating to something he had not accounted for, and he nodded once, more to himself than to the boy, and then his gaze moved briefly back to Emily, not seeking permission, not asking for direction, but acknowledging her presence in a way he had not before, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different kind of steadiness, one that did not come from control, but from intention. "I do not know everything I should," he said, "and I cannot change what has already happened." And he paused for a fraction of a second, not searching for words, but choosing them carefully. "But I can choose what happens next." And the statement hung in the air, not as a promise, not yet, but as something closer to a decision forming in real time, and Ethan watched him quietly, his expression unchanged, but attentive, as if he understood more than he needed to say, and Emily remained still, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, but there was something different now, something softer at the edges, not expectation, not relief, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted. And Daniel took another small step forward, closing the distance just enough to feel less removed, less distant, and for a moment he simply stood there, present in a way that did not require explanation, and then he spoke again, his voice calm, grounded in something new. "Would you like to show me what you build?" And Ethan's expression changed then, just slightly, not into excitement, not into surprise, but into something more open, more certain, and he nodded once, a small but clear answer. "Yes," he said, and the simplicity of it settled into the room with a quiet finality, because it was not just an answer to a question, it was the beginning of something that did not erase the past, did not resolve everything that had been left unfinished, but created space for something else to exist alongside it, and Daniel Hayes, who had spent years defining outcomes before they happened, realized in that moment that this was not something he could plan in the same way, not something he could control completely, but something he could choose to be part of, one moment at a time. Daniel did not realize how much the room had changed until he noticed that nothing felt urgent anymore. The constant pressure that usually followed him from meeting to meeting had faded into something quieter, something slower, and for the first time in years, he was not thinking about the next decision, the next deal, the next outcome. He was standing still, present in a moment that did not require him to win, only to understand, and Ethan's small nod lingered in his mind longer than expected. Not because of what it meant on the surface, but because of how easily it had been given, without hesitation, without conditions, and Daniel found himself studying the boy again, not searching this time, not analyzing, just observing, noticing the way Ethan's shoulders relaxed slightly, the way his eyes held a quiet confidence that did not need to prove itself, and something about that felt unfamiliar, not because it was strange, but because it was simple, and Daniel had not allowed much in his life to remain simple for a very long time, and he shifted his weight slightly, glancing back toward the desk where the photographs and documents still rested, silent reminders of everything that had led to this moment. But they no longer felt like the center of the situation, they felt like context, important, but not immediate, and he turned back toward Emily, meeting her gaze with a steadiness that had changed, no longer guarded in the same way, but not fully open either, as if he was still learning how to stand in this space without the usual defenses, and he spoke, his voice calm, measured. "You said you tried to find me." And the question was not sharp, not demanding, just part of the understanding he was beginning to build, and Emily nodded once, her expression unchanged. "I did," she repeated, and Daniel took a slow breath, his eyes briefly lowering before returning to hers. "Why did you stop?" And the question lingered, not as blame, but as something he needed to understand to see the full picture, and Emily's gaze softened just slightly, not with emotion that spilled over, but with something steadier, something that had already settled within her long ago. "Because I realized I was the only one looking," she said, and the words landed quietly, without force, but they carried a weight that did not need to be emphasized, and Daniel felt it, not as a sharp reaction, but as a slow, steady realization, the kind that does not demand attention but reshapes everything once it is understood, and he nodded almost imperceptibly, acknowledging the truth of it without trying to reshape it into something easier, and Ethan shifted slightly again, his attention moving between them, sensing the shift even if he did not fully understand every word, and Daniel looked at him, his expression softening just enough to reflect something new, something that had not been there before, and he crouched down slightly, lowering himself just enough to meet Ethan at eye level, the movement unfamiliar but deliberate, and for a moment, he simply stayed there, not speaking, not filling the space with questions or explanations, just present, and Ethan did not step back, did not look away, he simply stood there, meeting Daniel's gaze with the same quiet openness he had carried from the beginning. And Daniel felt it again, that subtle shift, the difference between being observed and being seen, and he spoke, his voice quieter now, not because he needed to be, but because it felt right. "I cannot explain why I did not come back," he said, and the honesty in the statement felt different from anything he had said before, not calculated, not measured for effect, just real. "But I can listen now." And Ethan watched him for a moment, considering the words in a way that felt thoughtful beyond his years, and then he nodded once, a small but clear acceptance, and Daniel straightened slowly, the movement controlled but no longer rigid, and he glanced once more at Emily, not for confirmation, not for approval, but as part of the same moment, and she met his gaze with a quiet steadiness, something unspoken passing between them, not resolution, not yet, but recognition, and Daniel turned back toward the desk, not to retreat behind it, but to gather the photographs carefully, his fingers smoothing the edges as if acknowledging their importance in a way he had not before, and when he set them back down, it was not to dismiss them, but to place them where they belonged, part of the story, not the entirety of it, and he looked back at Ethan again, his voice carrying that same quiet steadiness. "Do you have your blocks with you?" And Ethan shook his head, a small smile forming for the first time. "They are at home," he said, and Daniel nodded once, the answer settling into something more than just information, something that implied a next step, a place beyond this office, beyond this moment, and for the first time, Daniel Hayes did not feel the need to define exactly how that step would happen, only that it would. Daniel stood still for a moment after Ethan's answer, the quiet simplicity of it settling deeper than anything else had, because they are at home was not just a statement about blocks, it was a line drawn between two worlds, one he had built and one he had never stepped into, and for the first time, he was not thinking about how to bridge that gap with efficiency or control, he was simply aware that it existed, and that awareness carried a weight he could not ignore, and he glanced toward the door of his office, then back at Emily, his expression thoughtful in a way that did not rely on certainty, and he spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. Then I should see where that is. And the sentence did not sound like a command, did not carry the authority he was used to. It sounded like something else entirely, something closer to a request, and Emily watched him for a moment, her gaze steady, measuring not the words but the intention behind them, and she did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of habit, as if she had learned not to react too quickly to promises that might not hold, and Daniel did not push. Did not fill the silence, he simply stood there, allowing the moment to exist, without forcing it forward, and Ethan looked between them, sensing the shift without needing to define it, his small hand resting lightly against the edge of the desk, grounding himself in a space that was still unfamiliar but no longer intimidating, and finally Emily nodded once, a small, deliberate motion that carried more meaning than a longer answer ever could, and Daniel exhaled quietly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, because he understood that this was not acceptance, not yet, it was simply the beginning of something that would have to prove itself over time, and he moved back toward the desk, reaching for his phone without the urgency that usually defined his actions, and when he picked it up, he did not immediately start issuing instructions or clearing his schedule. He paused, looking at the screen as if reconsidering what mattered in that moment, and then he set it back down without making a call. A small but significant decision that shifted the direction of everything else that might have followed, and he turned back toward them, his posture steady but no longer rigid. I will clear the rest of the day, he said, not as an announcement, but as a choice he had already made, and Emily's gaze flickered briefly, not with surprise, but with something more cautious, as if she had learned to expect less so that she would not have to adjust when things changed, and Daniel noticed that too, the subtle restraint, the absence of immediate belief, and he did not try to challenge it, did not try to convince her otherwise, because he understood now that words were not what mattered here, not yet, and Ethan shifted slightly, his attention returning to Daniel, his expression thoughtful. Do you have to work? He asked, and the question was simple, but it carried a perspective Daniel had not considered in years, and he paused, just for a moment, before answering. I always have work, he said, and then he added, quieter this time. But that does not mean I always have to choose it. And Ethan nodded once, accepting the answer without questioning it further, and Daniel felt something settle in that exchange, something that felt less like a decision and more like a direction, and he reached for his jacket, not as a signal of departure, but as part of a movement that no longer felt rushed, no longer driven by external demands, and as he slipped it on, his gaze moved once more to the photographs on the desk, the edges now slightly worn from being handled, and he picked them up carefully, sliding them back into the envelope with a precision that felt different this time, not controlled, but respectful, as if acknowledging their place in a story he was only beginning to understand, and when he set the envelope aside, it was no longer something to be questioned, it was something to be carried forward, and he looked back at Emily and Ethan, his voice steady, grounded in something new. We can go when you are ready. And the words were simple, but they carried a weight that extended beyond the moment, because they were not about leaving the office, they were about stepping into something he had never allowed himself to enter before, and Emily held his gaze for a moment longer before nodding again, and Ethan moved closer to her side, not out of uncertainty, but out of habit, and Daniel watched them for a brief second, not as strangers anymore, not as a problem to solve, but as something real, something present, and as he moved toward the door, opening it without hesitation, he realized that this was not a step he had planned, not something he had prepared for. But it was one he was choosing, and for the first time in a long time, that choice felt like it mattered more than anything else waiting outside that room. The hallway outside Daniel's office felt different as they stepped into it, not because it had changed, but because he had, and the quiet rhythm of footsteps that usually echoed with urgency now carried something slower, something more deliberate, and people who passed by glanced toward him out of habit, out of recognition, but their presence barely registered this time, because his attention was no longer divided across a dozen priorities. It was centered on something much closer, something walking just a few steps ahead of him. And Ethan stayed close to Emily's side, his small hand brushing against hers as they moved, not clinging, not uncertain, just grounded in a way that felt natural, and Daniel noticed that too, the quiet connection between them, the ease of it, something that had been built over years he had not witnessed, and he did not try to interrupt it, did not try to step into it too quickly, because for the first time, he understood that presence was not something you could claim, it was something you had to earn, one moment at a time. And when they reached the elevator, the doors opened with a soft chime, and Daniel stepped aside slightly, allowing Emily and Ethan to enter first, a small gesture that felt unfamiliar but instinctive, and as the doors closed, the mirrored walls reflected the three of them standing together, a composition that did not fit into any version of his life he had previously imagined, and for a brief moment he caught his own reflection and did not immediately recognize the expression looking back at him, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was unguarded. In a way he had not allowed before, and the elevator descended smoothly, the numbers lighting up one by one, and no one spoke, not out of tension, but because there was nothing that needed to be said right then, the silence itself carrying a quiet understanding, and when the doors opened again to the lobby, the world beyond felt louder, brighter, more unpredictable, but Daniel did not hesitate, he stepped forward, holding the door as Emily and Ethan walked out ahead of him, and the late afternoon light filtered through the glass entrance, casting long reflections across the polished floor, and for the first time in a long time, he did not feel the pull of everything waiting for him inside the building. He felt the pull of something outside of it, something he had never accounted for, and as they moved toward the exit, Ethan looked up at him briefly, his expression thoughtful. "Do you know how to build towers?" he asked, and Daniel paused for a fraction of a second before answering, not because he did not know, but because he was considering the question differently now. "I know how to build a lot of things," he said, and then he added quieter, "but I might need help with yours." And Ethan nodded once, as if that answer made perfect sense, and they stepped outside, the air cooler, carrying the faint sounds of the city, and Daniel took a slow breath, the kind he had not taken in years, not rushed, not calculated, just present, and he glanced briefly at Emily, meeting her gaze, and there was no expectation there, no immediate resolution, just a shared awareness that something had shifted. Something that could not be undone, and did not need to be, and she spoke softly, her voice steady. "We are not far." And Daniel nodded, not asking for details, not needing them yet, because for once, he was not focused on the destination, he was focused on the act of going, on the decision itself, and as they began to walk, the distance between them no longer felt like a gap to be measured, but something that was slowly, quietly changing, and Daniel Hayes, who had spent years building a life where nothing was left to chance, realized that the most important thing he had ever been given did not come with a plan, did not come with instructions, it came with a question, a child's simple question, and the choice to answer it not with words, but with presence, and as he walked beside them, not ahead, not behind, just beside, he understood something he had forgotten long ago, that sometimes, the most valuable thing you can build is not a company, not a legacy, but a moment you choose not to walk away from.